Okay, well, welcome, guys.
Morning, everyone.
Morning, Stedmans. If you turn, we're gonna dive in then. If you've got your Bibles, Luke chapter 15, and we're gonna have the story of the prodigal son. I'm gonna ask George to read it. Do you mind?
Story.
Yeah, we'll read the whole story. That'll be the longest part of the
Jesus
devotion.
continued. There was a man who had two sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in the whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. But when he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. And the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And so they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. 'Your brother has come,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound.' The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him.' 'My son,' the father said, 'you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we have had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.'"
Okay, it's a really great story, quite a famous story, but it's easily misunderstood or just part understood. Let me just acknowledge Tim Keller. The insights that I've got for this come from Tim Keller. Really good on this, so I'd encourage you to check him out on this. But it's often called the story of the prodigal son. It could also be called the story of the loving father, or it could be the story of the two sons. It depends on how you look at it. But as we have a look at what's happening here, firstly, some insights that are really helpful to have. In Jewish culture, to ask your father for your share of the inheritance is basically to ask, to say, "I can't wait until you die," because the son would inherit when the father died anyway. So when he's saying, "Can I have my inheritance now?" he's saying, "I can't wait for you to die. I want the stuff now." So that's a real insult, a terrible insult. The second thing is this. It says it was the younger son that asked for the inheritance. Now, the younger son only gets 1/3. If you've got two sons, well, let me put it this way. However many sons a father had, the oldest son would get a double portion. The rest was divided between everyone else. So the younger son would have got 1/3, the older son 2/3. So he was asking for 1/3 of his father's estate. And then the next thing that's important to understand is, again, in Jewish culture, a patriarch's status, that's like an older man of standing in the community, his status was determined by his property. So the more property he had, the wealthier he was, the higher his status, the more respected he was. So by his son asking to take 1/3 of the land, it was also to diminish his father's status and standing. His father wouldn't have the standing in the community that he would have had. So it's a real disregard to his father in that way. But the key thing is this: the son wants the father's stuff so that he can go and spend it doing what he wants to do. He doesn't want to live under the father's authority anymore. He wants his own independence. He wants his stuff, and he wants to go out, strike out on his own and live life how he wants to live it. Okay, so then he goes off and does that, as you know, and he squanders everything his father has worked for, and probably his father's father before him. They've built up the family estate. He squanders his whole third. He comes to his senses, it says, when he's feeding pigs. He's really down and out. And he remembers that even his father's servants there was bread for them, and here he is feeding pigs. So he decides he's going to go back to his father. But he says he's going to say to his father, I'm not worthy to be your son. Let me be like one of your hired servants. And this shows a real change. Hello, Abby.
Hi, Abby.
We're just thinking about the story of the prodigal son in Luke 15, okay? But anyway, so this son, when he decides to turn back to his father and says, I'm not worthy to be called your son, let me be like one of your hired servants. What he's saying is this: you see, as the son lived in the father's house, the father would have had servants living in his house, but hired servants or slaves, they didn't live in the house. They weren't part of the family unit. They worked for him. They would come in and work. And what his son was essentially saying is, look, I want to pay you back. I want to work off what I've squandered. So now he's been, respectful and doesn't see himself as worthy. So he makes his way back. The father, it says, runs out, sees him from afar, runs out to meet him. Now that is a real shocker, because it was a very undignified thing to do, because they wore these, the robes. He'd have had to gird up his loins, as it were, expose his legs and run. It wasn't a dignified thing for a man of standing to do. What you would have expected, and what the Jews, as Jesus told this story, what they'd have expected the father to do, when he saw his son coming from afar, they'd have expected him to think, right, this better be good. He better, he'd be interested to see what his son's got to say. It better be good if I'm going to have him back in any way, shape or form. And so the hearers would have been stunned that he didn't do that. He just ran out, threw his arms around him, and he said, put a ring on his finger. And that was a signet ring. In those days, you didn't sign letters. You put your signet ring on it. And you seal it on a kind of a bit of wax. And it identified you as part of that family. So by giving him the family ring, he was welcoming him back fully into the family. And so the son comes back and they throw a party, and he kills the fattened calf for him. Now, here's the other thing. It's different in our day, but in those days, people rarely ate meat. It wasn't something you did often.
Yeah.
And so, and if you did, you probably ate goat or one of the cheaper kinds of meat, maybe lamb. But to kill the fattened calf, that was the most expensive. This was like, you only did it for like a wedding or something like this. And his father was essentially saying, this is a day of great celebration. This is the best day of my life, by celebrating in this way. And so he welcomes the son back. But then there's the other son. And the other son gets disgruntled, and he doesn't like it. And he says, he refuses to come in. So the father has got to go out and plead with his son to come in. And this son says, I've worked with you all these years. I've served you, and you've never killed the fattened calf for me. And the father says this to him: everything I have is yours. And he was being literal there, because there were 2/3 of the estate left, and it all belonged to the son. He was going to get all of it, everything. The other son had no inheritance now, but this son, he was going to inherit everything. And he said to his son, everything I have is yours. You've always been with me. But the son refused to come in. Now, here's the takeaway from it. When we think about that story, we often think about the son that went and squandered everything and think what a bad son he is. and what a good son the other one is, and it wasn't really very fair on the other son because he's never had the fattened calf killed for him. But what it shows is that actually the two sons, in one sense, were the same. They were both doing what they did to get their father's stuff. That's what it was all about. The concern of the older son was the father was being extravagant, and it was his inheritance that was being diminished in throwing this party. It was the father's stuff. I've served you all this time. The son felt the father owed him his stuff. And what it shows also is the older son had no care about the father's heart. The father was delighted that his son was back. And rather than if the older son loved the father, he'd have shared in that joy, but he didn't. He was just concerned about his stuff. So the takeaway for us is this: in our relationship with God, are we all about what we can get from him? You know, do we relate to him because we think if I'm good and I obey and everything else, you know, God's owes me good things? Do I relate to God because I want security, because I want, you know, material things, because I want health and all these other things? Or is it because he is good and worthy of our love? You know, he in himself. That is where both the sons failed. One truly repented, the one that we would have thought was bad. But do you know what? We're not told if the good son ever repented. Jesus leaves it, doesn't tell us. And so, you know, maybe we can think of ourselves, I was once bad like that younger son, but maybe we think we're trying to be good now. But why are we trying to be good? Because we want stuff from God, or because we love God? So I want to encourage us to, you know, reorientate our thinking and ask ourselves, you know, is it God I love, or am I just after his stuff like the older brother, being good to get what I can? Well, let's pray a short prayer and then we're done.